This boat is about to sink. She is the Sea King, a fishing vessel operating off the coast of Oregon. Three on board are going to die. When the Sea King's engines failed, the U.S. Coast Guard struggled for 5 hours to tow her to safety across the notorious Columbia River Bar. The Sea King's hold and engine room were taking on water, dangerously destabilizing the boat. When they found out, it was too late.
Can you get on the loud hailer and tell them to get off the boat?
Just stand by, stand by. Let them get out away from the boat. I got it. Stand by. Starboard side. Port side, Gary.
The sea can be perilous and fickle, but for a sailor, there's a far greater risk. The unseen danger of human error.
Starboard side, get the line break.
The QE2 is the most famous passenger ship in the world, the last in a long line of celebrated Cunard ships, reaching back to the Lusitania, the Mauretania, and the Queen Mary. Like her predecessors, she was built for the transatlantic crossing from England to New York. But the jet age revolutionized travel. Instead, she became the queen of the cruise ships, admired wherever she went. On the QE2, life was one long party. But there was nothing for Cunard to celebrate on August 7th, 1992, a day that would bring crippling damage to the ship, a major loss of business to the company, and a sad finale to an illustrious career. The QE2 was coming to the end of a week-long trip up the east coast of the United States. She'd spent the day cruising off Martha's Vineyard in Massachusetts. As the anchor was hoisted and the ship set off on its journey to New York, the passengers were in good hands. The captain of the QE2 has the top job in ocean liners. Robin Woodall had been at the helm for only 2 years, but he'd spent his entire 40-year career with Cunard. As the ship headed through the tricky waters of Vineyard Sound, Woodall had access to all the latest navigational aids. He also had the services of a pilot, brought aboard for his expert knowledge of these waters. But at 2 minutes to 10, on a balmy New England evening, the QE2 hit bottom, tearing a gash in her hull from the bow to midships. It was a major emergency. The QE2 limped back to Boston, but not before 1,824 passengers were evacuated, all with tales of an unexpected night at sea.
When we felt this real big shudder, and it went away and it came back again.
All of a sudden the ship started to rumble, and it just got worse and prolonged.
When we hit that deep rumbling vibration, it was, my heart started to race. I was really quite frightened.
To assess the damage, the QE2 went into dry dock. The world's most prestigious ship had a gash in the hull that would cost millions of dollars to repair. Perhaps the greatest embarrassment was to Captain Woodall, a man held in awe by his peers.
I have nothing to say whatsoever at all, so please don't waste your time in trying to speak with me.
The incident was so sensitive, the National Transportation Safety Board called on Paul Esbenson, its most respected investigator, and a senior captain himself. Esbenson flew to Boston to meet the QE2 when she arrived.
Because of my past experience, I've crawled under thousands of ships. I went under there, looked at the damage. I was quite surprised at the amount of damage was underneath there. You can see where the damage started up on the bow of the ship, and it went back on both sides, primarily on the port side, but both sides. The keel was damaged quite a bit.
Esbenson knew the QE2 had come very close to disaster. The damage was so extensive, a lesser ship might not have survived. Only the QE2's double bottom had stood between her and catastrophe. But how could it have happened?
The master was anxious to get to New York. He had a schedule to keep. Once they got clear of the narrow area up there, he asked the pilot if there are any speed restrictions up here. Then the pilot said, I don't think there's any speed restrictions. He can go. So what they did, they increased the speed from about, they started out at 12 to 18. They went up to 25.5 knots. 25.5 knots for that size ship, but any ship is a good speed.
According to the official report, the pilot was following a course down the north side of Vineyard Sound when the captain asked if they could change direction. He wanted to head south, he said, to a course they'd used earlier that day. The change would take the QE2 through shallow water only 39 feet deep. The charts on the bridge indicated it wouldn't be a problem. The QE2 had ample clearance. The pilot saw no reason to object, and the ship turned south. That explained why the ship was where it was, but it didn't explain why she struck bottom. The QE2's draft, the part of the ship below water, is about 32 feet. The chart of Vineyard Sound showed she had several feet of clearance. Something was wrong. Could the chart be in error? The National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, is responsible for charting the waters around the United States. Their last survey of the area was in 1939. Following a series of predetermined grid lines, the ship used echo sounders to locate the depth. Had they missed something?
Now, the technology that was used during that time, the echo sounder was such that it would see only a very narrow area right below the sounding vessel's hull. So essentially, we would know the depths very precisely along these lines. However, we really didn't know the depths in between the lines.
Another survey was urgently needed, this time with the latest equipment. Modern side-scanning sonar misses nothing. Its sweep is much wider than equipment used even in recent years. The survey became top priority. NOAA's credibility was at stake. The survey found several spots shallower than the 39-foot depth on the QE2's charts. Cunard believed that this explained the grounding, but for the investigators, questions remained. If the QE2 had hit rocks, which rocks? There was only one way to find out. Remarkably, in the murky depths of Vineyard Sound, divers from NOAA located paint on two rocks in the area the QE2 was thought to have gone aground. They named them Red Rocks 1 and 2. But was the paint from the QE2? Joe Epperson, a metallurgist at the National Transportation Safety Board, was assigned the job of finding out.
This is the samples that we received from the bottom of the Vineyard Sound. These are other two known samples that were taken directly off the hull of the QE2. We were asked to see if we could match these samples to the QE2's paint system.
In such a high-profile case, a simple eye match is not enough. Epperson used an electron microscope to magnify the samples.
Basically, we're looking at the cross-section of a layer of paint. This is the entire thickness of the paint, and within that we're seeing several different layers. One being up here, which is more of a surface layer, and then basically a primer and first coat layer down here. And we're looking at probably 10 to 15 thousandths of an inch thickness. Do enough matches, you can come up and say that that total paint sample was consistent with the total paint sample that I knew was from the QE2.
So it was the QE2's paint. There could be no doubt. Captain Woodall's ship had hit Red Rocks 1 and 2. But for investigators, it seemed that there was more to this case than outdated charts. The numbers didn't add up. It seemed impossible until a naval architect came up with a remarkable theory. Ash Chatterjee joined the NTSB a month after the QE2 went aground. This was his first investigation, but he was about to make a name for himself.
When I started investigating this accident, I knew the ship's draft was 32 feet, and the water depth in the area where it ran aground was a nominal 40 feet or more. So one had to explain where the additional 8 feet of sinkage came from.
Chatterjee's speculations revolved around an unusual hydrodynamic phenomenon known as squat. As a ship plows the sea, the water between its keel and the sea floor is compressed, so this water has to flow faster. The faster the ship moves, the faster the water flows beneath it. As it does so, the sea level around the ship drops, taking the ship down with it. In effect, the ship is digging a hole for itself and sailing along in the hole. The phenomenon was known about, but it didn't seem relevant since squat had never been known to make a difference of more than 1 or 2 feet, not the 8-foot drop of the QE2. Ash Chatterjee realized everyone was missing the point. Squat is only a problem in shallow water. In harbors, for instance, ships usually travel at low speed, say 10 knots. So the effect of squat is not very pronounced, only a foot or two.
Since that's the usual condition of operation, most pilots, and ship captains and operators assume that that squat is always of the order of 1.5 to 2 feet.
But the QE2 was doing 25 knots, unusually fast for water of this depth.
If you double the speed of a ship from 10 knots to 20 knots, you really don't just double the squat, you increase it by a factor of 4.
Chatterjee's calculations showed that at the speed the QE2 is traveling, she would have squatted at least 8 feet. This, in addition to the outdated charts, appeared to be the answer. The finding took everyone by surprise. But none more than the QE2's Captain Woodall. Despite decades of experience, he was as ignorant as everyone else to the dynamics of squat.
He was aware of squat, and his feeling was that it was 2 or 3 feet. But the vessel is not required to have these the squat determined at different speeds and at different depths of water, and it's still not an international requirement.
The QE2 accident woke the shipping industry to a hidden danger at sea, and the disquieting truth that even the finest ships afloat are vulnerable to human error. Shortly after, Captain Woodall handed his ship over to a new captain. But when another ship went aground, the scope of the calamity would stun the world and launch one of the most controversial investigations in maritime history.
Mayday, mayday, mayday.
Before dawn, on the 24th of March, 1989, the lights in the distance belonged to a supertanker.
We're approaching the tanker, and we're slowed down through the ice field here. Really can't see anything.
The ship's hull has just been ripped open on a reef, and the Coast Guard is on the way to assess the situation.
We're at her stern. Smell oil over here on this side, on the downwind side.
Within half an hour, she has hemorrhaged 115,000 barrels of oil. The spill will go down as North America's worst environmental disaster. The ship is the Exxon Valdez.
A little bit after midnight, the phone rang, and it was the Vessel Traffic Service watchstander, Skip Blanford, calling, and he reported that the Exxon Valdez was hard aground on Bligh Reef. And my initial reaction was, are you kidding? Are you serious? And he said, I'm as serious as a heart attack.
The 987-foot supertanker had left the regular shipping lanes to avoid some ice. The maneuver is common. Ships then return to the proper channel. But this time, the Exxon Valdez failed to make the key turn to re-enter the shipping lanes. Instead, she impaled herself on the rocks of Bligh Reef.
After a few minutes, we realized somebody's going to have to go out. We called in one of the only inspector that we had. He and I both went out to the ship.
We're approaching the Exxon Valdez. She's hard aground, and they're shifting the boarding ladder to the starboard side so we can try and get aboard without getting in the oil.
As dawn broke, they climbed on board. Attention quickly focused on the ship's captain, Joseph Hazelwood.
It was very quiet. Captain Hazelwood was just staring across the deck of the ship.
Hazelwood had every reason to keep his counsel. The Exxon Valdez had just devastated an area of outstanding natural beauty, turning it into a stagnant death trap. Prince William Sound is where the Alaska pipeline meets the sea. The Valdez oil terminal was built despite local opposition and warnings that disaster was inevitable. On Good Friday, 1989, the Exxon Valdez and Captain Hazelwood made the worst fears come true. In hearings, it would later be revealed that Captain Hazelwood was not even on the bridge at the time, preferring to hand command to an unqualified crew member.
We have a destruction, a man-made destruction that probably has not been equaled since Hiroshima.
But in that first encounter with Captain Hazelwood on the bridge, something else struck Tom Falkenstein.
I walked up and spoke with Captain Hazelwood and noticed the odor of alcohol in the immediate vicinity of only the captain, so it was a logical conclusion that the captain had been drinking. I dismissed it in the back of my mind as a man who had just seen his career go down the tubes. And so he went and had a drink.
But according to the NTSB report, Hazelwood had spent part of the afternoon drinking. Investigators tested him for alcohol after the accident, but too late for the results to be reliable. Still, they suspected Hazelwood's performance had been impaired by alcohol. He should have been on the bridge as the ship left the Sound. Investigators then turned to the ship's radio and Hazelwood's communications at the time of the grounding. Recordings were sent to a psychologist at the National Transportation Safety Board, Dr. Malcolm Brenner.
Speech has been recognized in the law enforcement community as a factor that can be related to alcohol impairment. And in his speech to our investigators, it sounded as though he was not as sharp as might be expected or as sharp as he'd been at other times.
I'm Valdez traffic.
Yeah, it's Valdez back. We should be on the radar there. We've fetched up hard to ground north of Goose Island off Bly Reef. Evidently leaking some oil, and we're going to...
The NTSB's voice analysis equipment was used to examine Hazelwood's transmissions.
Valdez traffic, go ahead. Yes, we've departed the pilot, or disembarked the pilot, excuse me, and this time hooking up to C-speed.
The device could pick up tiny changes in Hazelwood's pronunciation and inflection. If he was drunk, they needed to hear him sober.
We were very interested in a sample of the captain's speech from the day before, when the vessel was inbound to Valdez. This was of special interest because there was no evidence of alcohol use by the captain prior to making that recording.
Okay, she's going to depart at 2300. All right, yeah. We'll get with the pilot, see if we can go 2 tugs instead of 3.
One of the most consistent findings in the alcohol literature is a slowing of speech. When people are under alcohol, they tend to speak slower.
Hazelwood's speech at the time of the accident sounded slower to investigators.
Yeah, it's Valdez back. We should be on the radar there. We've fetched up hard to ground north of Goose Island off Bly Reef.
We found that there were very dramatic changes in the master's speech. He was speaking about 64% as fast as he did the day before. And compared to alcohol literature, this would be characteristic of someone with a history of alcohol abuse who is speaking under a very high level of alcohol exposure.
Having ruled out fatigue, the NTSB was sure Captain Hazelwood had been drinking. But the tests weren't conclusive proof. Hazelwood's slow speech could have been due to unfamiliarity with certain words. So investigators focused on 2 words he used countless times each day.
WHCP, Exxon Valdez back.
They isolated the call sign Exxon Valdez and calculated how long it took Hazelwood to say it when sober.
Exxon Valdez. Exxon Valdez.
Then they analyzed it at the time of the grounding.
Roger that. Be waiting your call. Traffic out. Okay. Exxon Valdez. Over. Standing by 13 and 16. Exxon Valdez. Exxon Valdez. Exxon Valdez.
Exxon Valdez was also slower, about 76% as fast. Again, a level that's characteristic of alcoholics under a very high level of alcohol exposure.
Exxon Valdez. Exxon Valdez. Exxon Valdez. Exxon Valdez. Okay, roger.
Although voice analysis remains controversial, the NTSB finally concluded that Hazelwood was drunk. The board reported that one of the probable causes of the disaster was the captain's failure to order a proper navigation watch because his judgment was impaired by alcohol. The oil tarnished 1,000 miles of Alaska's shore and decimated untold wildlife. To date, the cleanup has cost Exxon more than $2.5 billion. Captain Joseph Hazelwood has not sailed as a captain since that time, but he did get a job training maritime students in the arts of seamanship. But the consequences of human error can't always be washed away. In the dead of night, a freak accident would plunge a train into a murky swamp, and investigators into a tantalizing mystery.
Mayday, 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 mayday.
In 1993, the steamy quiet of an Alabama bayou was shattered by the worst train wreck in U.S. history. 47 lives were lost when Amtrak's Sunset Limited out of Los Angeles bound for Miami plunged off a bridge into the black mud below. An old bridge, a fast train. At first, it looked like a relatively straightforward derailment. But a year later, when the investigators' report appeared, it would tell a very different story. Brad and Susanna Dix had joined the ill-fated Sunset Limited at New Orleans with Brad's mother.
We were sitting in the car waiting for it to leave, and nobody had said anything about the emergency exits or the facilities on the train. So my mother, she was sitting there the aisle across from us. She asked, you know, where is the emergency exit? And we all kind of looked around, and the gentleman next to her said, well, it's right here. So we did take note of it, and that was probably what saved our lives.
In the middle of the night, Brad was awakened by violent movements of the train.
The train car was, you know, violently shaking. We couldn't see outside the windows. It was pitch black outside. So, you know, there for a minute, you know, we didn't know what was going on, but soon we realized, you know, that the train had to be wrecked.
At 2:53 in the morning, the Sunset Limited had left the tracks, taking part of the bridge with it. The rear of the train had survived intact on the bridge. The chief conductor came forward, saw the chaos, and made an emergency call.
I told the operator that we had a very bad accident. I was on train number 2, the Sunset Limited. I was the supervisor on board, and we needed all the help we could get.
Stay on the line with me, sir.
Yes.
Okay, you with the Amtrak train?
Yes, ma'am. I'm the supervisor on board. We're on the Mobile River.
You on the Mobile River?
On the Mobile River. We got cars burning there over the bridges. There's people in the water. We're trying to help them, but we need help.
A couple seconds went by. We knew we had to get out because we could see water rising on the window. And also, at the same time, we saw water roll in from the front of the car.
Their car was sinking. Getting out of the train was the first priority. Brad's mother's inquiry about the location of the emergency exit was about to pay off.
We could see that there was a wall of water coming in through the front, so we knew we had to get out as soon as we could. So we ran over to the emergency exit, me and my mother and my wife, and began to try and open it. You pull a handle, and there's a rubber grommet that goes all the way across the window. That's about 12-foot long rubber ring out of the window, very cumbersome and takes some time. Me and my mother and my wife, we were the only ones to exit out of that window. There was quite a few passengers, you know, sitting all around beside us, but nobody else but us got out.
Many of those who did survive would owe their lives to the presence of a tugboat, the Movilla. It had witnessed the accident and was sounding the alarm.
Mobile Coast Guard, we've got a mess up here. This train has run off the 14-mile railroad bridge. The train has run off the 14-mile railroad bridge. The bridge was open, the train run off of it. And it's burning, man, it's burning. Part of it's hanging off of the bridge on the west side. I see people, I'm going to try to rescue what I can, over.
The Movilla placed the derailment here at the 14-mile railroad bridge, but a telephone call to the bridge's watchman scratched that theory. There was no train off his bridge. The Coast Guard knew a passenger train had gone off a bridge, but which bridge? This part of Alabama is a maze of remote and inaccessible waterways. The railway crosses a number of them as it heads northeast towards Florida. People were dying in the water, but rescue teams couldn't find them. The crew of the tugboat Movilla may not have known where they were, but while they waited for the Coast Guard, they pulled 17 people out of the water. They were the heroes of the hour, but only later would the true extent of the Movilla's contribution be recognized. The Coast Guard's Dave Adcock was the first to arrive on the scene. He was stunned by what he found.
A lot of the area behind me here where the engine was in the water, I guess the big belly tanks, I think they hold 4,500 gallons of diesel fuel apiece, had busted open, and that ignited, and you had basically fire everywhere. You had fire in the water, the diesel fuel burning off the water.
Adcock had found his way there by following the glow of the fire up the Mobile River. It led him to a small waterway not normally used by commercial traffic. It was called Big Bayou Canoe, and it was on the railroad bridge crossing it that the train had derailed.
I could see a train car sticking up out of the water on the other side of the bridge, and there was a car underwater there. It's just a corner of the car sticking up. And one of the engines was speared into the bank on the other side, the lead engine, I think it was.
If investigators thought they were dealing with a simple derailment, something was about to change their minds. A crane was used to drag the lead engine out of the bank where it was buried. The crash had done terrible damage, but investigators spotted some curious marks which could not be explained by the impact. They must have been caused by the engine hitting the bridge, but it could only do that if the bridge had been knocked out of line before the train got there.
The bridge was displaced about 44 inches off to one side, and then the railroad train came along at the speed of 72 miles an hour and struck that off-center bridge like that, and it just literally launched itself into the air. So that leads on to the next question: what happened? How did it happen? And why it happened?
The trail of clues pointed to the railroad bridge, but it would soon lead investigators back to the tugboat, Movilla.
Mayday, 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 mayday.
The convergence of river and rail has made Mobile, Alabama one of the busiest ports in the United States. Here, raw materials arriving from the Gulf of Mexico are offloaded to continue their journey by train or on huge barges pushed by tugboats. The Movilla was just such a boat. Loaded with cargo, it was heading upriver when Amtrak's passenger train, the Sunset Limited, plunged into the bayou. That day, the tug had been pushing 6 huge barges, lashed 3 abreast. According to the official account, the captain had taken on board a local pilot whose job it was to guide him and the barges up the Mobile River. When they found themselves at the accident site in the fog, the pilot was at the helm. His name was Willie Odom. When Captain Paul Esbenson of the NTSB began asking questions, Willie Odom was his first port of call.
My leading question somewhat, I would say, I find out that he was very reluctant to talk about what he saw on the radar. We find out his information was very sketchy.
To get a clearer picture of what the Movilla's pilot would have seen on his radar, Esbenson decided to run the river himself.
The Movilla came up here in the fog because he couldn't see the banks. He couldn't see the head of the tow even. It was rather thick fog at that time. However, it was quite clear on the radar if he could interpret the radar. And that was a problem. He really didn't know what he had on the radar. He was in the fog. He was, in his mind right now, he's looking for a place to tie up temporarily, or a tree or something to put a line on just to hold himself there until the fog lifted.
The fog had reduced visibility to almost zero. In his anxiety to find a tree to tie up to, and unable to read his radar properly, the pilot was in danger of losing his bearings. Unknown to Willie Odom, he was now leaving the main channel of the Mobile River and entering the unfamiliar waters of Big Bayou Canoe. Odom couldn't find a tree, but on his radar he spotted an alternative.
What we're looking at here is exactly what the pilot on the Mobilla saw at the time. He saw an obstruction across the river, thinking it was another tug and a string of barges that were tied up to the bank, 90 degrees to the bank, waiting for the fog to lift.
Then something happened. What Willie Odom didn't know, only that a number of his barges were suddenly adrift. The captain of the Movilla now took over the helm.
And seems to have a cable or something wrapped in the wheel. Barges afloat adrift southbound. And if anybody down there can help round them up, I would definitely appreciate it.
But almost immediately, the crew of the Movilla was distracted from their own problems by the rail accident on the bridge. At once, they moved to lend a hand.
I believe we're right below the train. There's a hell of a fire pin in the middle of the river. There ain't supposed to be no fire pin. Like I say, I don't know exactly where we at. It's so foggy, I can't tell by looking on the radar. So there's something bad wrong up here.
Mobile, Mobile Group, Roger, sir. I also just want to confirm that you're not involved in a train derailment, over.
I can't tell you for 100% whether I'm involved in it or not. We're right below it. I'm not sure what's going on. I come up here and it was so foggy I can't tell where I'm at. And he scared the guy on watch, and he went backing up and hit the hill and broke our tow up. So I'm not sure what's going on. I just know that I can't get away from the barges where I'm at. I'm going to try to get out of here and see if I can go up there and help somebody.
Despite the confusion on the Movilla, it appeared the survivors had reason to be grateful for her presence. But as Paul Esbenson discovered, what Willie Odom had seen stretched across the river was not another tugboat and barges. It was a bridge. The discovery gave new meaning to the Movilla's radio communication immediately after the train wreck.
Mobile, Mobile Group, Roger, sir. I also just want to confirm that you're not involved in a train derailment, over.
I'm not sure what's going on. I come up here and it was so foggy I can't tell where I'm at. And he scared the guy on watch, and he went backing up and hit the hill and broke our tow up.
The radio message told Esbenson that the Movilla's tow had been broken up by some sort of a collision in Big Bayou Canoe. Could she have hit the unlit bridge and knocked the railroad tracks out of line? Part of the answer lay at the bridge itself. There, Captain Esbenson found marks and abrasions on one of the concrete bridge supports.
Well, the damage obviously was something struck it head on. It's right on the point. It struck it head on, and this is what. And of course, you'll see the damage on the top too. That was flaked off. But that's what led us to believe something struck it, something big.
For Esbenson, it was a vital clue, but it wasn't proof. He needed to look at the Movilla's barges. Esbenson immediately noticed that one of them was slightly dented at exactly the same height as the damage on the concrete pier of the bridge. But if the Movilla's barge struck the bridge, that alone wouldn't explain the derailment. The critical piece of evidence still lay at the bottom of the bayou.
Mayday, 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 mayday.
Amtrak Sunset Limited had hurtled off a bridge at 70 miles an hour and plunged into an Alabama bayou. Now all eyes focused on the scene of the accident. To solve the mystery of how it happened, investigators had to recover the main beam of the bridge, which was now underwater. Based on his examination of the Movilla, Paul Esbenson knew that if the outside barge hit the bridge as he suspected, the jolt would break the tow and the two parallel barges would ride ahead.
This outside barge at that point struck the concrete of the bridge. This we've through evidence and established that through the measurements we've made. Because these two barges here, they disconnected from this one because they rode ahead and this stayed where it was. So they rode ahead and struck the bridge.
It was an elegant theory, but that's all it was.
But I had to prove it. That was a big thing, to be able to prove what you believe happened, you know.
For proof, Esbenson was relying on the missing section of the bridge. When it was finally salvaged from the bayou, the damage from the train was plain for all to see. But Esbenson wasn't interested in the obvious. He wanted to see the underside of the girder, the part that might have come in contact with some runaway barges.
There was marks on there that were not marks that were as a result of the train striking the bridge or knocking it over. This was other marks. It was marks that the train couldn't get to, but the barge could get to. So, again, I put the whole thing together and measured the marks on the barge and everything else, and come to the obvious conclusion: the barge hit the bridge.
For the safety board, that was the proof they needed. Their report was published a year later. It said the derailment was caused by the Movilla hitting the bridge after taking a wrong turn. It also found that the tug's pilot, Willie Odom, had received inadequate radar training. Odom has since surrendered his pilot's license. The experience of passengers like Brad and Susanna Dix led Amtrak to improve its emergency procedures. And the railroad bridge at Big Bayou Canoe now has lights on it.
It takes a catastrophe, a big casualty like that, to change the rules, you know. Even though it's obvious that you need lights on a bridge like that in the dark, it's obvious for this, but you don't do it until something happens, you know.
47 people died that night at Big Bayou Canoe. In its report, the NTSB made one more sobering observation. The Movilla struck the bridge at 3 knots, enough to displace the rails by 38 inches, but not enough to break them. The Sunset Limited roared towards the bridge, having just received a green all-clear signal. Had one of the rails been severed, the green would have changed to red, triggered by a break in the electric circuit. 47 lives might have been saved if the Movilla had been going faster and broken the rail. The error was only human, but the consequences were huge. With the command of any ship comes awesome responsibility. One mistake, and the outcome could be a devastating oil slick, a badly damaged hull, or worse. Our lives are in the hands of those on the bridge.
Investigating some of the world's worst maritime disasters, revealing the fatal flaws that caused them. Next on TLC, Adventures for Your Mind.